PU.
At least I get to talk about it with Jose.
When I first thought about responding to a PragerU video, I was going to fact-check one of their convoluted, distorted fact dump videos, like this one titled, "Conservatives Are the Real Environmentalists."
When President Trump announced his intention to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord, environmentalists warned of imminent disaster. Yet a year later, it turned out that the United States led the world in reducing carbon emissions. It did so without surrendering its national sovereignty.
The claim here is that the US brought down emissions, all while ignoring the Paris Climate Agreement. Considering the Paris Agreement has no means of enforcing its goals, we don't get an explanation for why leaving it helped, or why its policy would somehow stop the US from lowering its emissions, but apparently international agreements are somehow surrendering national sovereignty. The video doesn't dwell on stuff like that on purpose. Let's take a closer look at the supposed hypocrisy here, though. The US is apparently the leader in reducing emissions, while the EU and China all had increases. Of course, if we actually look at the sources for these claims, we get a different picture. In 2019, emissions went down in the United States by 140 megatons, or 2.9% of total emissions, bringing the total to 4.8 gigatons. Here's what the PragerU vid said about the EU.
The EU released an additional 40 million tons of carbon dioxide into the air that year.
So we now have this very clear comparison. The US is lowering emissions, while the EU is increasing them. Except when you look at the IEA numbers that PragerU used to trumpet the US's accomplishments, we find out the EU has actually decreased its emissions, even more so than the US, with a drop of 160 megatons, or 5% of its total emissions, to reach 2.9 gigatons. So in 2019, not only did the EU do a better job of lowering its emissions than the US, it also seems to be decreasing at a much faster rate. So where did PragerU get its numbers that the EU's emissions have been going up? Well, it turns out there was a little bit of rhetorical trickery here.
The EU released an additional 40 million tons of carbon dioxide into the air that year. Yet a year later, it turned out that the United States led the world in reducing carbon emissions.
We're not comparing the same years. The PragerU video is looking at numbers that come from 2017, also cited by the IEA, but if you look at their list of sources, they quote an article from Scientific American. I can only imagine the reason PragerU didn't use the primary IEA source in its lengthy list of sources is they don't want the few people who actually read these sources to notice that they're cherry-picking data, deliberately choosing one of the US's better years and comparing it to one of the EU's worse years, something that would be very obvious if you were citing two IEA reports from different years. And now I'm already exhausted. It took me, 3 minutes to contend with about 30 seconds of nonsense from a PragerU video. That's why so many responses to PragerU videos, excellent as they may be, tend to stretch on and on. I didn't even get to the part where it ignores the per capita pollution stats when comparing the US to China, or even the supposedly extreme goals of the Paris Climate Agreement don't go nearly far enough to combat climate change. And if we're talking about reducing emissions, it shouldn't be seen as some sort of global horse race or competition. It has to be looked at from the context of reducing global emissions in a way that will positively impact the climate and reduce the effects of climate change. So this comparison between the EU and the US as to who's doing a better job when neither side is doing nearly as much as they should be is pretty pointless. And what PragerU videos do so well is stake out a conservative position, present moderation as being on the extreme left, and then disguise their claims with half-truths and cherry-pick data. The end result is a YouTube video that's the equivalent of conservative junk food. No real substance, and arguments that completely sidestep the real issues. So instead of a lengthy debunk, I want to talk about another PragerU video I found. One of the emptiest videos I've come across in a while. It's titled The Intolerance of Tolerance, presented by Greg Koukl. Before I begin, you might be wondering who Greg Koukl is. He's been banging on about tolerance meaning something different to the left for close to 15 years. He's a Christian apologist who affirms that evangelical Christianity is under direct attack. In a 2013 speech, also titled The Intolerance of Tolerance, he drops observations like this.
A sentiment, I think, began to change very rapidly regarding two religions. Oddly, our culture became much more sympathetic to Islam and much more hostile to Christianity.
That's a statement so obviously not true, you barely even have to look at the spike in hate crimes post 9/11 that has consistently stayed above previous levels. And to look at the other half of his claim, we can look at the numbers against Christians, and FBI stats from 2013, the year Kokol gave this speech, doesn't get granular enough to look at evangelicals, but even if we assume that all Protestants are evangelicals, they represent 3.8% of all victims of hate crimes, a far cry from the 13.7% of victims being Muslim, especially when you consider the relative size difference in these two populations. And as for changes over time, if we compare it to the pre-9/11 levels, Protestant Christians have been around 3.6% of the victims of hate crimes, while back then Muslims were at about 2%. So while Christian levels have been pretty even, anti-Muslim sentiment is very clearly going up. So yeah, this guy isn't exactly one for facts. And this is a video that will absolutely prove that, as he presents us a lot of rhetoric and almost no facts or evidence. What's exasperating about this video is how it uses imaginary positions that people on the left supposedly have. Here's one example.
To be tolerant today simply means you agree with politically correct, that is, left-wing positions. That's all it means. This is easy to show. Name one position that differs from the left that they don't label intolerant.
The evidence he provides that tolerance is a common refrain among the left is nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not even an anecdote, just a vague feeling that this is how the left operates. It's a thing that could be true, I guess, but it's hard to really say without any actual evidence about how true it may be. Intolerance is then attached to a really cringy acronym.
As Dennis Prager puts it, six-herb, sexist, intolerant, xenophobic, homophobic, Islamophobic, racist, bigoted.
So this is framing these labels as personal attacks, supposedly bypassing the actual arguments. I would sooner argue that these labels are applied as a direct result of the arguments being made. So if someone is using a racial stereotype or trying to trot out bogus race science as part of their argument, a type of rhetoric that has been shown to be damaging to certain racial groups, why is it wrong to call it racist? It's possible to use one of those labels incorrectly, of course, but they describe things that still exist in the real world. To deny that they exist, in effect, provides better camouflage for racists to sneak in their arguments. Here's another example of how this video misunderstands rhetoric on the left.
The left says all behaviors and ideas have equal value, that no behavior or idea is any better than any other. They don't act that way.
I have no idea what he's talking about here. How can you agree that all ideas are equal when the left supposedly only favors ideas on the left? This is obviously being set up to pretend the left is being hypocritical and apply value judgments just like people on the right do. The only problem is, no one on the left believes or has ever claimed to believe that all ideas and behaviors are equal. Ascribing a belief to the left that isn't true and then calling them out for hypocrisy that doesn't exist is a complete waste of time. It's much more convenient for Kokol's argument to pretend this is true. And once again, we get no evidence that the left believes any of these things. We're just supposed to assume that it's true. Eventually, though, we do get some evidence of the left supposedly using those bad labels to silence discussion. Two news stories are cited. One of J.K. Rowling facing backlash for a comment considered transphobic, and another news story of Martina Navratilova facing similar criticism. The problem is, when you look at the sources for these stories, you find the criticisms are pretty fair and make thoughtful responses. They don't just scream transphobe and move on. The Fox article details why J.K. Rowling's tweet was transphobic, providing the backstory, context, and Rowling's own personal history with statements that have upset a segment of her fanbase. I especially like the one that was directed towards Navratilova after she wrote transgender women could not fairly compete against cis women. This comes from Athlete Ally, an advocacy group for LGBTQ people in sports that expelled Navratilova from their advisory board.
Athlete Ally unequivocally stands on the side of trans athletes and their right to access and compete in sport free from discrimination. Martina Navratilova's recent comments on trans athletes are transphobic.
If you stopped reading at transphobic, yeah, I guess it would just seem like they're labeling her transphobic and calling it a day. But they go on to describe why they use that term and why it's very fitting to the statements she made.
Based on a false understanding of science and data, and perpetuate dangerous myths that lead to the ongoing targeting of trans people through discriminatory laws, hateful stereotypes, and disproportionate violence.
It seems respectful, thoughtful, and refrains from making any personal judgments about Navratilova. Just because someone says something transphobic doesn't necessarily make them a transphobe, although I would say it's strong evidence to support that claim, but I respect the restraint here. What's the problem? Anytime comments can be labeled as hateful, folks like Kokol take it personally. It seems there is no way to adequately describe anything considering transphobic or bigoted without running into that problem. Here's Kokol describing what he hears when he's called intolerant.
The conversation is about Mr. Kokol's personality, right? Mr. Kokol's intolerant, Mr. Kokol's arrogant, Mr. Kokol's narrow-minded. I guess you're saying that I'm mean. Well, all right. Why don't I just agree to that? Why don't I agree with you that I'm really mean? And then we'll just settle that issue, and we can set it aside, and we can get back to what we're supposed to be talking about here.
Intolerant is often used as a more polite way of describing views that could be considered bigoted or hateful. Not every time, of course, but with regard to, say, the earlier examples of J.K. Rowling and Martina Navratilova, yes, I would say that claiming trans people are not the gender they say they are, denying their existence and perpetuating a social order that increases their social isolation, leading to real mental and physical harm, is a form of intolerance. It's so much easier to call those statements what they are, transphobic. It doesn't mean that the person saying them has to be thrown into a gulag. It does mean that they should rethink their comments. What this video is supposedly arguing for is treating all people as equally valuable, not their ideas.
True tolerance means we treat all people as equally valuable, with kindness and with civility and with the freedom to express their ideas, even when we disagree with them.
If we did not challenge J.K. Rowling or Martina Navratilova when they said things that could be considered transphobic, or at least didn't challenge them in the ways they used names they didn't like being called, are we perhaps ignoring the real harm created by transphobic rhetoric? I think it's important to confront people's ideas and label them what they are when they clearly demonstrate those qualities. A fuller critique, yes, does go into detail why those things are bad, but to say that the label itself is shutting down conversation when it really is just a response to a statement, putting it into a context and attaching to it an understanding that is being denied by people who'd rather not these words be applied. It's not the label that's the problem. It's what the label represents. A popular understanding in the culture that they are in fact wrong. And let's not pretend that only the left applies labels to people.
This is obviously not tolerance. This is blatant intolerance. Your accusers are guilty of doing exactly the same thing they're accusing you of doing.
If we're going to use this dopey argument that the left uses the word intolerant as a cudgel to stifle debate, as soon as he applies the label intolerant on me, I could just use the same tactic he does and say he's trying to hijack the debate, calling me a name, and I could easily ignore the substance of what he's saying. I hope you noticed I didn't actually do that. I responded to most of his video here. I'm not going to pretend my feelings are so badly hurt that being called intolerant has completely stopped me from making my arguments and countering his. What this entire discussion is about isn't about the labels, it's the feelings people have when they're applied. We're being asked to spare the feelings of people who want impunity to use rhetoric that harms others. Videos like this read to me like conservatives are waving the flag of defeat. They have no real arguments left and are instead trying to police our language. That's why this video is so devoid of any real substance. In fact, there's a PragerU video from July of 2018 starring Dave Rubin that says a lot of the same things already. It was titled, "So You Think You're Tolerant?"
The left, sadly, has become utterly intolerant of anyone with whom they disagree.
The videos are so similar that the sources cited are literally copied and pasted from one video to the next. The Kokol video also does this to another PragerU video starring Michael Knowles. Technically, this isn't plagiarism because PragerU is just copying itself, but it does show us how these talking points get repeated with nothing of substance being added, and that this video is offering no facts or evidence of its own, just recycling the same complaints as seen in other videos. Looking at the list of sources for the Kokol video, we can see how much effort went into his thesis. Of the 24 sources cited, here are the unique ones. We have the Vox article on J.K. Rowling and the Nation article on Martina Navratilova. There are 3 other PragerU videos cited. There's a quotation from philosophy professor Peter Kreeft. Kokol cites the YouTube speech I pulled clips from in this video, and he cites his own website 5 times. Of those 5 links, 4 of them are broken, by the way. Might want to get that fixed. And to say something quick about citing yourself, that's actually a completely legitimate move. If you're citing something published through a third party, like an academic journal or reputable media outlet, but citing your own website or your own speech, that adds nothing. That's just you saying the same thing twice. The other 11 sources are lifted directly from other pages, sometimes copied and pasted verbatim, often referring to news stories that aren't mentioned in the video at all. Not that anyone reads these sources, of course. One of the sources cited is a video by Michael Knowles, and when I clicked on it, I saw it had 46 views. To sum this up, this video is devoid of value and free of facts and effort. It is conservative junk food. As a small coda to my people on the left, sometimes we can be a little mean and could be a little bit nicer, but don't fall for these sort of crocodile tears from people on the right who say they simply cannot engage with debate on the left because we use these mean names. It's just a trick to get us to stop using terms that have real value and impact. The statement from Athlete Ally summed it up so beautifully. When we use the word transphobic, we're describing something that's presenting a false understanding of science and data, that perpetuates dangerous myths, that leads to the ongoing targeting of trans people through discriminatory laws, hateful stereotypes, and disproportionate violence. That's what the word transphobic means. When people say we use it to shut down arguments, that's not true. We're responding to their statements by describing them for what they actually are. They want to pretend transphobic means nothing. That seems more like them shutting down the argument because we used a word that they simply don't like. Yeah, another short video. I don't know if I'm going to make this a habit or not, but this was fun to make, and this one was a little rough around the edges. I hope not too rough. The big video is still coming. I don't know when, sadly. Maybe in the next 3 weeks. I hope. I genuinely don't know. It's another one of my sitcom retrospectives. It's literally the longest video I've ever done, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. I think it's one of my better videos, so I really hope people will see it soon. And for people wondering when the next conservative book review is coming, I am halfway through a book that is just the most racist thing I've ever read. It's wow. It's going to be a wild one. So everyone should look forward to that. The lovely names you now see moving up the screen are my delightful patrons. If you would like to be one of these delightful people, you can head over to my Patreon and sign up for a monthly donation. Once again, please only do this if it's something you can financially do. These are trying times, so if this isn't a realistic option for you, don't do it. But if it is, I appreciate anything anyone can spare. If you would like to support this channel in some way that doesn't involve signing up to my Patreon, you can do the YouTube usual, as I'm just decided I'm going to call it. Like, comment, and if you haven't already, subscribe and hit the bell. If you'd like to leave a comment but don't know what to say, tell me what your favorite song is, and I will listen to it. That sounds fun. Thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you all have a lovely day.